My name is Doug Rolling. I am the coordinator of Coquitlam Heritage's Oral History Project, and we're here at Mackin House, and it is September the 12th, 2012, and I'm talking to Helen Colley. Thank you for coming.
You're welcome.
Helen, it's my understanding from our conversation that you lived in Fraser Mills.
Yes.
Until you were 17. That means your childhood years and your teenage years. Perhaps you could talk about your childhood years first, and perhaps give us a picture of the location of Fraser Mills and what the buildings were like and how they developed. Do you think you could talk about that? Thank you for coming.
You're welcome.
Helen, it's my understanding from our conversation that you lived in Fraser Mills.
Yes.
Until you were 17. That means your childhood years and your teenage years. Perhaps you could talk about your childhood years first, and perhaps give us a picture of the location of Fraser Mills and what the buildings were like and how they developed. Do you think you could talk about that?
I sure could. I was born in the Royal Columbian Hospital. In those years it was a stone building and 18 beds in a ward type of place from what I remember. But I grew up, I was moved to Fraser Mills as a baby. And at that time there was these two houses at the top of the hill, and it went between other wooden houses and 3 streets leading east. And I was in the middle street, which was 2nd Street. And there were about 60 houses at that point. I think in the past there had been more, but there were about 60 homes when I grew up, and it was a very multicultural type society. There were, my parents were Norwegian, there were Swedes, Finns, 2 families of French Canadians, and every other mix. And that across the tracks and down a ways, right by the river, there was what was referred to then as Hindu Town, and that was where the Sikhs lived. And closer to the tracks, further away from the river, the Chinese. And the Wongs lived there. I went right through school with Emma Wong, from grade 1 to grade 12 with Emma, and her parents looked after the boarders that worked in the mill. And as an aside, I was told that the manager at the time did not want any conflict between the races within the mill. And the workers there apparently honored that, and they all got along. But that you would have, there must be people to interview about that.
Could I ask you, when you were going to school, and I'll ask you about that a little more later, but when you were going to school, were your schoolmates, would you describe the group as multicultural?
Oh, for sure.
Okay.
And it didn't matter to any of us. We were just school kids. And there was an East Indian girl in my class, and Emma, who was Chinese. And it was just, we were just school kids.
Okay. Now, I seem to recall that, and I may be wrong, correct me, that the first, at least English-speaking school was above the store in Fraser Mills?
Yeah,
what was your schoolhouse like?
That would have been way before my time, because the Millside was built in 1907, and the town site was just developing, and the The company, as far as I understand, built the school for the children of their workers in the town site. So I went to Millside, and I clocked it today. It's 1.2 kilometers I walked as a 5-year-old. And yeah, okay, I remember one day walking to school after 1 foot of snow in the evening, and in those days they wouldn't allow girls to wear slacks. Well, even when I finished high school, we weren't allowed to wear slacks or pants. We had to wear skirts, and we had cotton knit, long brown stockings and our boots, and we walked to school, of course, through, 1 foot of snow, and we got soaking wet, and when we got there, they sent us home. So we went home and changed into play clothes, and we were allowed to play outside, and we thought that was so funny that we weren't allowed to stay at school and dry out. We had to go home and play in the snow. So yeah, it was a fun day.
So the name of your school was?
Millside Elementary.
Millside,
yeah.
Okay.
And it had started out, it's still there, the main building, and there were the 4 large rooms in there, but they had 2 smaller buildings. One had been added, I don't know when, but there was for grade 1 and grade 2. And if we needed to use the washroom, we had to walk across the play field. And we had cloakrooms and a little heater with wood to keep those classrooms warm.
Yeah.
So that was grade 1 and 2, and the other 4 classes up in the big school.
Yeah. The physical setting, Fraser Mills, you talked about, I think 60 dwellings that were there. And were most of them family? Some were dormitory type situations for the mill workers?
There were 2 tiny, very small houses that some bachelors lived in.
Oh, yeah.
But there was also the boarding house, and next to it the cookhouse, which also had some rooms in it for single men. I'm not too sure how many, but there were women from the Fraser Mills community did the cooking there for those men, and the men in the office would come over for lunch and that type of thing.
Okay. I heard about the general store at Fraser Mills. Could you describe that? Because it seemed to be a kind of a hub, a center of life there.
Yeah, it was like a, what do you call them now? Community center. Yeah, there was a general store. It had everything, including at the entrance. They had big wooden barrels with dog biscuits in. My brother says the black ones tasted the best. So, and they had clothing, and that was also the post office. And Mr. Stewart, Olive's father, ran that store. He was
Olive McKay's.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Mr. Stewart, he did other things as well, but he was in charge of the store. And next to the store was a butcher shop. And then there was also a little building that was the first aid for the workers. Well, when I was very young, there was also doctors there for the town site. I went, there was Dr. Cameron, and I forget the other, and Dr., now the name escapes me, but he practiced there, and then during the war served overseas and stayed in Scotland to take up plastic surgery because he'd seen so many terrible injuries during the war. And he was the first plastic surgeon in Vancouver and had started as a general practitioner in Fraser Mills. Yeah.
Were there any other stores or services?
In Millardville, there were
There was, yeah.
thrifts and little Trevs for cigarettes, I guess. And
Yeah, yeah. What about transportation?
there was, before my time, there was a tram that went down into the mill. But from the 30s onwards, there was a bus loop. There was the railroad tracks, the boarding house, the cookhouse and the boarding house, and then the bus loop. And we had a bus from there into New Westminster. And then from New West, we could take the interurban into Vancouver.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I seem to recall at some point there was a tram from this area to New West. Was it still running when you were?
No, there was a trail through the bush down in Fraser Mills that had come from New West with the tram, and then it ran down the middle of King Edward. But it would have been halfway between here and the railroad tracks,
Okay.
and into New West.
Cars. Did many people own cars?
Most of them in the Millside, I think. My dad didn't. My dad had had an earlier accident and gave up driving. But yeah, most of them had cars.
So when you were a kid, getting around was mostly walking in the bus?
Yes. And all my years in school. Well, when we went to Como Lake and Coquitlam, first Coquitlam High and then Como Lake, that was 2 kilometer walk up Marmont Road, which is quite steep.
Yeah.
And a few years we had school bus service because there were kids from out Doss Hill and that way that had too long a distance to walk. So they would stop across the street here and pick us up and take us up the hill.
Okay.
But I have one story to tell you that when I was just a baby, my mother and my sister, who was 8 years older than me, were both sick in the Royal Columbian Hospital. I can't remember about my mother, but my sister had an ear infection and they had to remove a bone back here that now antibiotics would have cured, but they removed a bone behind her ear. And when they were sent home, they also came with a big bill because there was no Medicare then. And my dad had to see a lawyer in New Westminster to try to work out some type of payment plan. And while he was there, the lawyer asked him what his assets were, and he named off whatever he had. And one of his assets was a refrigerator. And the lawyer said, "You have a refrigerator? I don't even have a refrigerator." He was some annoyed. But my dad paid monthly on that bill until I was 15 years old. So that's what it was like before Medicare.
Indeed.
Yeah.
What did your dad do for a living?
He was a millwright.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Now, you were young during the World War II years. Did many of the residents of, the male residents, mainly of Fraser Mills, sign up voluntarily?
the only ones that went signed up voluntarily, as far as I know. And yes, my neighbor John Bow, and he's still alive. Maybe you could I could find his name and number for you if you want.
Please do.
And he joined the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the adult male, like my father, joined the, it was some kind of Rangers home, I forget what they called them, but they had guns and had monthly meetings, and yeah. And we also had blackouts, they were called. They would sound the siren, and our parents had to put blankets up against the windows and turn off all unnecessary lights.
Yeah, you would have experienced rationing.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about what that experience was like when you were a kid, and maybe when did it end?
We were rationed, but it wasn't anything that people couldn't live with. Like my mother was able to get butter from someone out in the valley who was a farmer, and she knew. And she would trade that with the neighbors for sugar, that type of thing. And we were allowed meat, and that, but limited. But I don't remember any hardships about it.
Okay. The general store, just to pick up on a question in my mind, was it a company store in the sense that
Yes.
the workers brought their chits, I guess they were called?
Well, my dad ran a tab or whatever, and then once at the end of the month would go and pay. Yeah, I never saw money cross hands. If I wanted something, I got it, and it was written down.
Yeah, and so the big mill, okay, Western Canadian. Can you recall, or were you aware of any changes in production? In other words, was it war production in any sense, or was it just for the wholesale and retail market?
That's I don't know anything about the sale. Henry Locken would be the one to. Yeah, I don't know anything about that. It was our playground. We weren't allowed anywhere near the river, but that's where we used to go. There was a small creek that ran through Fraser Mills and emptied into the river, and the pine sheds were built above it, and the train would come in there and load up with pine, and the pine would, in those days the pine had to be, the lumber was stacked up against the wall and around to dry. They didn't have any other way of drying the lumber, and we used to play hide and seek. And we also used to crawl underneath it and fish in a little creek. And my friend and I would catch these little trout and bring them home, and my mother gave us an old frying pan, and we built a fire outside, cleaned them and cooked them, and yeah. I almost drowned there once. That's one of her favorite stories.
Oh,
so.
really? Do you want to talk about that? Or?
Sure. In that creek, we had huge planks, like so thick, and they were logs with the tops and the bottom cut off, and they'd be about 12 feet long, and we used poles, and we'd pole ourselves up and down this little creek. And one day there was probably 10 or 12 of us went down, and the bigger kids and the boys had already got on their rafts, one on one end, one on the other, and they were underneath the roadway that was part of the pine shed. And my friend on one end and me at the other end, she started to pull before I realized, and I remember going backwards, head first into the water. And I remember my feet touching into the mud, and I had my hand up. But I would be at the most 4 or 5, and my brother was 2 or 3, and we said he was too small to be on these rafts. So he was standing on the bank and apparently started screaming and crying, and the watchman heard him and came running, and on my 3rd or 4th time up and down, he grabbed my hand. Well, the kids all came back, and we started walking home, and I was in the middle with all the other ones around me because we didn't want the parents to see one wet kid because we were not allowed anywhere near those waters. So we had to come up with some story to tell, and while we were getting ready for our little adventure, Mahinder Singh and his dad and uncle passed us and walked through the pine shed to get home. So we decided we would tell my parents, or that I would tell my parents, that Mahinder pushed me. And well, that was the last of it as far as I was concerned. I never got into trouble. But when And when I was that young, I had just, we called them page boys, just short little, short hair. But years later, I had braids, and my mother was braiding my hair, and I said to her, "Do you remember the time when I told you Mahinder pushed me in?" "Oh, yeah," she said. "Your dad was heading down for Hindu Town with what I was told was murder in his eye. And he ran across the watchman who told him what had happened, that my brother Bob was standing on the bank crying, and he had hurt him and came and, yeah, but he was a very annoying, well, I guess, a 4-year-old daughter getting pushed in. But anyway, so I remember that very well.
Oh, that's good that you can tell us about that. That's quite an adventure. What about your teachers when you were in school? Just sticking with the childhood theme, what were they like? Were they local people or?
No, I don't think so. They came out from Vancouver and New Westminster. But we had one, Miss Atkins, who had been there forever. She retired when I was in grade 5. She was 65 then, and was a spinster, never married, and had devoted her life to the kids and was an excellent teacher. Yeah.
So it was, would you describe it as a kind of one-room schoolhouse setting through all the grades? Or did you have different teachers for different subjects?
Yeah. No. Just the one teacher for whatever grade we were in. Never, until we got to grade 7, we didn't have more than one teacher for the year.
What subject did you like and what subjects didn't you like?
I liked the sciences.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't like the English or the language so much.
Okay.
But in I think it was grade 5, there was a teacher's strike or some problem. Later there was another one, but we had to go on split shifts. So some of us started at 8 and finished at noon, and then others started at 1 and finished at 5. Yeah. I had one friend who never told his mother, so in the morning he would go to Colony Farm, and so he was gone for a long day.
Yeah, okay. Perhaps we could shift to the teenage years. Always a big change. You went to high school.
Yeah.
Where?
I went, when I first started in junior high, grade 7, Coquitlam High School was still open. It was on Austin Avenue. And it went to grade 12, but 8 years before, when my sister was going through school, it only went to grade 9. And she and her peers had to go to New Westminster to school. And they either went to Coquitlam, which was the academic, or Trap Technical, which was more for secretaries and boys going into woodworking. So when I got there, it went all the way to grade 12. So I did the first 7, 8, and 9 in Coquitlam High School, and grade 9 to grade 12 up at Coma Lake. And at that time it was Coma Lake Junior and Senior High School. And that was a 2-kilometer walk.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. Mostly uphill, I think.
Yeah. So we didn't have televisions, and children were in good shape then.
Now, there was a term that I didn't quite catch. It's something to do with the way the students were streamed. Something tech you described?
Yeah, well, even when I was in high school, there were the two choices. There was the academic side. If you wanted to go into nursing or teaching, that type of thing. And so we got chemistry and that, and extra English. Or in grade 9, you chose to go into secretarial training and you learned typing and shorthand. Or the boys did woodworking and those trades.
Yeah.
They built at Coma Lake. They built houses.
To your recollection, when high school was done, did people go on to college or university? Was that common, not common?
For girls, we had the choice of nursing, teaching, or telephone operator. That was, and my dad wanted me to be a teacher, but I didn't want that. And then, yeah, but yeah, so that was, very few girls went into university. None that I knew went to university.
Yeah, okay. Now, teenagers and music tend to go together. What kind of music did you listen to in high school?
The best description I heard of my generation was that we were young, old people. And that made sense to me because we had a tendency to like the music our parents did. We did the same type of dancing. So we had Louis Armstrong, Frank Sinatra, that type of, yeah. So we weren't as original as the children now.
So you had a record player and...
Yes, and 78s. Yeah. But in my house we had classical music as well. It was a little different. So.
Perhaps for future audiences and young people now, you can describe what a 78 is?
There were 3 records, 45s, which were small, had a big hole in the middle, and played one song. And went at 45 RPMs, rate, turns per minute or whatever. Then the 78s turned a little faster, and they were maybe 10, 12 inches across, one song. And then there were 33, which are big platters and had 2 sides. Oh yeah, they had 2 sides. Mm-hmm. Before that, they had 1.
Now, sticking with the teenage years, a question that you might find impertinent and don't want to talk about, but what about dating and boys? How did that all happen? Because
personally, I was scared or nervous about that, so I was mostly just interested in friends, the whole group. And then, of course, there were school dances. Now, that was in the gym. And on one side, the girls would line up, and on the other side, the boys. And the boys just stood there looking at the girls. They didn't dance much. And then from up at Coquitlam High, or later Coma Lake, we'd walk home as a group to Fraser Mills. And if Emma was with us, we'd all, 10, 12, whatever, and probably more kids, would all walk her down across the tracks to her home and then drop the rest of us off. So I didn't do much dating as such.
Okay. You mentioned your group. High school usually means being part of a group or a crowd. How would you describe the crowd you mainly, as we would say, hung out with?
I had a couple of really nice friends.
Male or, well, I guess female?
Female, yeah. Really nice gal.
And how did you spend your time with your friends?
Well, she and I were on the basketball team, as short as I am, and so that was the thing I was most interested. I stayed in school because I liked basketball so much. And now I'm at least a foot shorter than basketball players today. But anyway, I loved the game. And so that was how I spent the last couple of years at school.
So the high school years were mainly the 1950s.
Yep, 51, 2, 3, 4. Graduated in 54.
Okay. And when you graduated, what happened after that with you? And maybe talk about, if you can recall, what happened with your friends after graduation.
Couple of the girls went to normal school, which was 1 year training, and then they were elementary school teachers. My best friend became an X-ray technician. Another one became a nurse. Some were secretaries. Yeah,
And you?
nothing. I took up bookkeeping and office work.
And you, I take it, went on and got married?
Yeah, it gets complicated in that.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
you don't have to.
No.
You don't have to go into that. But again, people went into, I take it, occupations. They didn't generally go on to university or anything like that.
A few of the boys did, but
Oh, really?
my brother got a degree, and some of his friends, yeah.
Oh, okay.
But none of the girls. No, just we weren't encouraged. Just were not encouraged to.
Again, in high school, what about social class? Did you say there was a social class division between working class and middle class in your high school, or was it?
I don't think so, or I didn't pay attention, and I've been told since that we were all relatively poor but didn't know. You know, it just working class. No, I didn't pay attention.
And again, what about the ethnic composition of your high school and the students? Was there a mix, or did that...
Huge mix.
Oh, really?
And there again, I didn't know until I was finished school that a person with the last name ending with an SKY or I was Polish or Ukrainian. I was familiar with French names.
Mm-hmm.
No, it just was not part of the scene. I don't think any of us paid attention.
Yeah, okay.
There was a Jewish family lived in the town site. I didn't know that till about 15 years ago.
Oh, really?
I just didn't know.
Okay. Fraser Mills was, of course, in close proximity to, as we say in English, Millardville, or in French, Meilleville. When you were growing up, child and teenager, what kind of connections, if any, did you have with people in Millardville, or?
We had to walk through Millardville in order to get to Millside School. And we knew they mostly spoke French. And there was the two French families down in the mill site. And I was Norwegian Lutheran, but my friend was French-Canadian Catholic. And on occasion I would go to church with her.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Did kids from Millardville, especially high school, were they mainly educated in Millardville, or did some of them go to your high schools, or?
The Catholic school charged for the kids to go. So in Millside School, there were some French-speaking kids, and they were the poor ones, but nobody told us. You know, we just thought some went up the hill and some came to our school.
Yeah, okay. Fraser Mills as a town site, you've described some of the buildings and the residences. Um, when you were leaving high school, can you recall if Fraser Mills grew from in population and in buildings, or was it mainly the same as when you
No, it started to shrink.
it shrank? Can you talk a little bit about that and why?
Well, they put the Lowhita Highway right through King Edward Avenue, and there were some homes, either a few torn down and a few moved up the hill here. And then when they put Highway 1 in, it took out the front yard of the house the second house I lived in, yeah. So when I first started traveling on the highway and saw things like Toys R Us and Auto Center, it was like going through a cemetery with that type of commercialism for tombstones, and it was not very comfortable. Fraser Mills was a wonderful community to grow up in. Everybody knew each other, we were safe, and yeah, it was just...
Well, that's one of the things I was going to ask you. Nowadays we experience a lot of crime and a lot of nasty crime. What about policing and crime in Fraser Mills?
We had one constable who tried to keep us off the road in our roller skates. That's about all I had. That's the only trouble I ever got in with him. And no, we never, if we locked the door, we left the key obvious and the window beside the door open. No, there was...
And this constable, would this constable be part of the BC Provincial Police?
No, he was part of the mill community, the town site.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think he was paid by
So
the
who
lumber
exactly
company.
employed him?
The lumber company.
Oh, I see. Okay.
You'll have to ask the boys more about him because
Yeah.
they were more venturous.
I would imagine. I would imagine. So, crime, did you experience any crime?
No, I was never even warned. My mother wanted her children to be independent. I think when I was 5 or 6 years old, I was given 2 nickels and told I could go to the movie in New Westminster. And I was probably 8 when I took my friend down the road didn't want to take her younger brother to the movies, and her mother paid me the 10-cent 5 and 5 for the fare and the entrance to the movie, and I took her little brother. So and I was never warned, never told to.
Well, I suppose here's the inevitable question. Did you lock your doors?
Yeah, but that's when if we did, we put the key where you could see it,
Mm-hmm.
and left the window beside the door wide open, so, no.
Yeah, sounds like a pretty tight-knit community. Can you remember ways in which people helped each other out and ways that maybe they don't nowadays?
One man talks about his parents owning a lawnmower, but everybody, well, the neighbors all borrowed it. We didn't have a telephone when I was very young. The neighbors had a phone, and everybody used for the few times you needed to make a phone call, either doctor or whatever, you went next door to the Bows to use their phone.
And when did you get a phone? Can you recall?
I was more than 10, so that would be 1946. And it was party line, so our ring was 2, somebody else was 1, and there was 3. And if you picked up the phone, if there was someone talking, you had to hang up and wait till they were off the line.
For the benefit of younger people who might be viewing this, can you explain how a party line worked?
there were at least 3 people or 3 families sharing a phone, and there was no dial in those days either. You picked up the little earpiece, and the operator would come on, and you would tell her the number you wanted. And then if there was an incoming call, it would ring once, and then once again, and once again. Well, that might be our phone number, but if it rang ring, ring, that was the neighbors, so you didn't answer that. And then there were stories of everybody listening in and knowing who was, yeah. So everybody knew everybody's business and who they were talking to.
One thing on my mind is, and I think this would be of interest to all age groups nowadays, to the extent that you can remember, what about the costs of things, for example, groceries compared to today?
I looked at my dad's income tax once, and he was making just over $3,000. In the town site, the rents were very low. I think we paid $25 a month, and we had 4 bedrooms, a living room, dining room separated by French doors, and a huge kitchen. Very nice place for under $30. We didn't have to pay for electricity or water. Oh yeah, and we used to get any leftover pieces of wood that would fit in the stove, and we used wood to cook with and heat the house with. And the wood was delivered by those big horses. What are they called with the big feet?
Draft horses?
Clydesdale. Yeah, Clydesdale.
Yeah.
And there'd be 2 horses come with like a dump truck, a wagon, and they'd dump the wood in our back alleys, and then we had wood sheds to put the wood in for the winter. And one time, I was probably 4 or 5, and they gave me a carrot to feed this horse, and I'm putting my hand up, and I can see this huge, big mouth. My hand just went down. No way was he getting close to my... Yeah, didn't want any part of that.
Yeah.
So that was fun. So it was our job, my brother and I, we had to put the wood in the woodshed. And can I tell a story on him?
Absolutely.
He had learnt the whistles that the man used. He would stand back and whistle at the horses, and they would start on their way, and then the wood would fall out. And they were in the middle of the back lane once, and my brother used the whistle he had learned, and the horses started. And Mr. Philpott came running and was really mad. So the back lane was full of these little pieces of wood. So that's one of his favorite stories.
What about things like bread, eggs, that sort of thing? Can you recall what they cost?
No, can't.
Oh, that's okay.
Can't. I don't have a clue.
There is a theory that smells are the most powerful trigger of memory. Can you remember when you were growing up the smells that you would have experienced in Fraser Mills?
Oh yeah, the cedar and fresh cut lumber. We were down in the mill all the time and around all that. Yeah, so when I smell fresh cut lumber, I'm back at the mill.
Yeah, it takes you back.
Yeah.
And Christmas, what about smells at Christmas and that sort of?
No, I wouldn't associate any smells with Christmas.
And other holidays like Easter? I mean, what would you do at that time?
Christmas, well, I was in a Scandinavian family, and we had Christmas Eve. And quite a few of my friends did, so it was absolutely great. For my mother, she said she got rid of all the mess at night and could cook the turkey with no problem. And we could go out and play with our friends with all our new toys. So.
Now, the Scandinavian connection, this is something that Joe Cook mentioned to me, and you mentioned Norwegian. Were your parents born here? Did they immigrate
No,
here?
my dad immigrated to New West. Oh, that's an interesting story. He spent 10 days on the boat getting into Halifax and then on the train, and he had enough money to get to Winnipeg. And when they got there, the other Norwegians said, "You can't stay here, it's so flat." So one of the men loaned him enough money to get out to New Westminster. And years later, my brother drove a secretary home and went in to meet her dad, and it was the man who had loaned my dad the money.
Really?
Yeah. So, and my mother came through the U.S. and then up to here. I never asked them how they met. I'm assuming they met at a dance. Or that's...
What about language? Did your dad, for example, retain the Norwegian language? Was it spoken in your house?
They only spoke Norwegian if they didn't want us to understand what they were talking, because my dad had heard of other children failing grade 1 because English was a second language, and he didn't want us to be held back. And I've been sorry about that ever since. But anyway, that's... so I knew a bit of Norwegian, but not very much.
Yeah, and were there any customs or cultural things that were practiced in your home that you wouldn't describe as Norwegian? Or?
Christmas was Norwegian, but other than that, it was North American, Canadian.
Yeah. Did your dad ever talk about why he emigrated?
No.
Mm-hmm.
My mother did because they were poor. Mm-hmm. And one by one, her older siblings had left for America. And finally, one of them came over and brought the mother and the two youngest to North America.
Did you have any Norwegian relatives visit you, or
No.
no?
Nobody could fly. There weren't planes going then, and it was a long journey and expensive. No one could afford it unless they were moving back there for good.
Okay. Is there anything that you would like to say, maybe in closing, about Fraser Mills? Something that you might want to communicate to, let's say, younger people today?
Well, I'm really proud that I grew up in a multicultural society that didn't make that an issue. It was an asset to know all these different cultures and the stories. And I, because of that, think that Canada is a great place because of being multicultural and respecting the other cultures and yet trying to become cohesive as Canadians. Yeah.
Okay. When you were in high school and in the 50s, and it's a kind of related topic, do you remember any big events to do with Canadian politics or BC politics that seemed to have an impact?
Yeah. There was Mackenzie King when I was young.
Yeah.
Oh, and I remember during the war that they tried to influence us to hate the Japanese. They were called Japs, and it was we did not appreciate them at all for what they were doing and what the threat. We knew there was the threat because of the blackouts and.
Yeah. So, but that ended, I guess, after.
Yeah, it didn't, yeah.
And again, a kind of related topic. Where did you get your news from?
At school, the newspaper, we had newspapers. Now I don't know whether, I think it was the Vancouver Sun we got, and Columbian, the New Westminster paper. Yeah, so that's how we got the news.
And what about radio?
Yeah, radio. And that was entertainment too, with all the weekly programs.
Yeah. Did you have a favorite program?
The Hallmark Theater.
Okay. Yeah. And so it was newspapers, it was
The radio.
and the radio. Did you have any television in Fraser Mills when you were toward the end of high school? I mean, they were starting to spread.
The first time I saw a television was the World Series in 1951
Oh yeah.
at Mr. Phillips' house, because he was in one of the first TV repair people in the area, and so his son was in my class, and there was a bunch of us went down to his place at lunchtime and watched the World Series, the Dodgers and the Yankees.
Okay.
So yeah, and then my dad got a television after I'd finished high school. Yeah.
And okay, so you saw a little bit of television. Would you say there were many televisions in Fraser Mills when you were in the later years of your high school?
That would be 54. I don't think there were any.
No? Okay.
Huh.
Well,
If there was, I didn't know about them.
Your interviewer is running out of questions. This
Okay.
is about an hour. Is there anything you would, again, like to add?
Some things were going through my head, but there was so much going on that I can't remember them. But
Yeah.
it doesn't matter.
Well, as
They
I
aren't
said,
important.
your interviewer can't think of any more questions, so if you have nothing to add, perhaps we could take that as a wrap.
Okay.